Marshall Earl Jefferson Sr. stood on Main Street in Eaton, Indiana, watching the column approach. It was 1945, and 600 German prisoners of war were marching through his town of 1,400 souls. As town marshal, Jefferson had many concerns about what was to come: the security, the logistics, the potential for escape or violence. But years later, when he spoke to family members about that day, he confessed his biggest worry. How would he keep the women of Eaton away from the German prisoners? This was not the concern military planners had anticipated when they scattered 700 POW camps across the American landscape, holding more than 400,000 German and Italian soldiers in rural communities from coast to coast. They had worried about security breaches, escape attempts, sabotage. They had not fully reckoned with what would happen when enemy soldiers became neighbors, when the abstract concept of the enemy collided with the daily reality of young men living behind barbed wire on the edge of town. What emerged was one of the strangest social experiments in American history, an unplanned integration of enemy combatants into civilian life that defied military regulations, challenged propaganda narratives, and produced outcomes that shocked both captors and captives. This is the story of how German soldiers became part of American communities in ways nobody intended, nobody fully controlled, and that history has largely forgotten. The camps are ghosts now. Few physical traces remain. The passage of time has erased the barracks, the guard towers, the barbed wire fences that once enclosed enemy soldiers on American soil. Contemporary newspaper coverage was deliberately sparse. Military regulations reportedly made it illegal to photograph the camps. What survives are fragments, a few photographs smuggled past censors, brief newspaper articles that revealed almost nothing, oral histories passed down through families like secrets. The Eaton camp was typical in its obscurity. On July 28, 1945, two brief articles appeared in the Muncie Star and Muncie Evening Press, matter-of-fact announcements buried among war news and local notices. German prisoners would be processed through Camp Atterbury, the large military base in Edinburgh, Indiana, for housing and labor in Eaton, a farming community town north of Muncie in Delaware County. Construction would begin within 2 days, the newspapers reported, though some evidence suggests it had already started. The camp would occupy 17 acres near the Eaton Canning Company, a division of Butterfield Canning. 600 prisoners would work while imprisoned. The camp, mostly tents, would be built by prisoner trustees, the first 50 men to arrive. About 600 prisoners will be brought to Eaton to help harvest tomatoes and work in canning factories, the newspaper stated with bureaucratic flatness. The camp will serve an area of a 30 or 40-mile radius. That was it. No discussion of what it meant to have 600 enemy soldiers living among 1,400 civilians. No exploration of the psychological implications or social complications. Just production statistics and construction timelines. The harvest took priority over everything else. The need was genuine and desperate. 2 million American men had left agricultural jobs in the 2 years leading to July 1942, drawn to war manufacturing or military service. The fields were emptying, just as the nation needed to feed both its own population and its allies overseas. The first enemy combatants turned POWs arrived in the United States in 1942, initially working on the West Coast, before the government began deploying them across the country. The Eaton camp was the fifth in Indiana, following or constructed simultaneously with camps in Windfall, Austin, Morristown, and Vincennes. Across 46 states, hastily built camps housed an army of enemy laborers who would cut timber, harvest peanuts, pick cotton, and process the vegetables that fed a nation at war. Brigadier General Ernest Bixby of Camp Atterbury assured the public that prisoner labor would be used only when civilian labor was unavailable. The Indiana Canners Association, representing food canning companies, had formally requested prisoners and attested that sufficient citizen labor did not exist. The prisoners would work at least 8 hours daily and be paid, according to early accounts, 80 cents per day, usable only at the camp commissary for essential items. The military tried to calm Eaton residents with promises: Prisoners would not receive rationed foods like butter, sugar, or choice cuts of meat. It would be safe to have them in the community. The ratio of prisoners to guards would be similar to civilian prisons. History would prove these assurances optimistic at best. The initial influx of prisoners had come through an arrangement with Britain, which had captured them but lacked space to house them all. The POWs were not all Germans either. Tens of thousands of Benito Mussolini's Italian forces ended up in American camps. Many German prisoners were not Nazis. Some were not even German, but Poles and other men from occupied countries forced into Wehrmacht uniforms in combat. These distinctions would matter more than military planners anticipated. The Geneva Convention, ratified by countries worldwide in 1929, ensured that POWs would not be subjected to public ridicule. This partially explained the sparse news coverage, along with security concerns. But in many instances, ridicule was the furthest thing from townspeople's minds. The reality was stranger and more complicated than military regulations had prepared for. John Harris, director of the local History Services Department of the Indiana Historical Society, would spend decades reconstructing what actually happened at camps like Eaton. His research, based on Army records and interviews conducted across multiple decades, revealed a world hidden beneath official reports and sanitized news coverage. The Eaton camp had a 10-foot barbed wire fence surrounding 17 acres. Guard towers stood at two corners, each large enough for one guard with a machine gun. 5 tents housed prisoners, along with a latrine, a small library, and a small commissary. A history of the similar camp at Austin, Indiana, apparently produced jointly by Germans and Americans, indicated camps also had small chapels for church services, and, reportedly, hidden moonshine stills. Prisoners were supposed to stay away from the fence, but some taunted guards by approaching within feet of the barrier. The camp's makeup on one documented day was 377 German privates, 22 prisoner non-commissioned officers, and a few dozen who did not or could not work. This snapshot showed fewer than the often cited 600 inmates, but the total approached that number in September when 100 more arrived. At that time, 44 American enlisted men guarded the facility. The ratio of prisoners to guards was not, as promised, similar to civilian prisons. It was far lower, and the implications of this would ripple through the community in unexpected ways. The public in Eaton was kept deliberately ignorant of potentially concerning events. When the camp at Windfall, Indiana flooded, prisoners were quietly transferred to Eaton. Suddenly, there were more prisoners living on 17 acres than there were citizens in the entire town of 1,400. Nobody thought to inform the townspeople of this development. The military operated on a need-to-know basis, and apparently, the citizens living next to the camp did not need to know. The information blackout went both directions. One prisoner, loading trucks at the Eaton Canning Company, expressed surprise that a shipment was bound for Chicago. He had been told German bombing had destroyed the city. The Nazi propaganda machine had assured Wehrmacht soldiers that American cities were burning ruins, that the industrial heartland had collapsed, that victory was inevitable. The reality of intact Chicago, of functioning canneries processing tons of vegetables, of trucks driving freely to cities that were supposed to be rubble, was the first crack in the propaganda edifice. But the real demolition of Nazi ideology came through daily contact with Americans themselves. This was what military planners had tried to prevent and what proved impossible to control. Sharon Hines, in a 1967-term paper drawing on Harris's research and family testimony, captured the essence of the problem Marshall Jefferson had identified. He says he can remember how the townspeople reacted when the prisoners got off the train and were marched down the main street of town to the prison camp. He said the only trouble they had was not with the prisoners themselves, but keeping the women in bounds, knowing that there were so many men around. This was not supposed to happen. Fraternization was strictly forbidden. Military regulations were explicit. Contact between POWs and civilians was to be minimal, supervised, purely functional. Romance was absolutely prohibited. The penalties were severe. Prisoners could face solitary confinement. American women could face legal consequences and social ostracism. But in small-town America in 1945, Most young men were overseas. The factories, farms, and businesses were staffed by women, children, and men too old or infirm for military service. And suddenly, there were 600 young male prisoners living on the edge of town, visible, present, and increasingly familiar. Anita Wright, director of the Eaton Public Library, recalled in 2007 what her husband's great-aunt had told her decades earlier. She and her friends would go walking downtown on a Saturday night and then over to the camp and talk through the fence. Some of the prisoners were pretty friendly. The image is striking. Young women in their Saturday best, walking deliberately to the camp perimeter, initiating conversations through barbed wire with enemy soldiers. This was not the scenario military planners had envisioned. This was not how wars were supposed to work. You were not supposed to flirt with men who had been trying to kill your countrymen months earlier. Yet it happened repeatedly across hundreds of towns. The military could not stop it without assigning guards to follow every young woman in every town, near every camp. The guards were already insufficient for controlling the prisoners themselves. Controlling the civilian population was impossible. The guards at the Eaton camp faced their own complications. According to Harris's research, most prisoners behaved because they felt well treated. The food was better than what they had received as soldiers. The work was hard, but not brutal. The accommodations, while basic, exceeded what many had known in combat. For men who had survived North Africa's deserts or the brutal Eastern Front, tent living in rural Indiana was relatively comfortable. Punishment, when necessary, was creative. Prisoners who misbehaved were required to get on their hands and knees on the road running through camp and overturn, by hand, each small stone that made up the road. This was sufficiently miserable to maintain discipline without violating Geneva Convention prohibitions against cruel punishment. The prisoners would spend hours flipping stones, one by one, under the sun while their comrades watched. The humiliation was often more effective than physical punishment. But the discipline problems were remarkably few. The threat of punishment was less important than the prisoners' own recognition that they had landed in an extraordinarily fortunate situation. They were alive, well-fed, safe from combat, and in a country that, despite being their enemy, treated them better than their own nation had. This realization produced a psychological transformation that military authorities noted but did not fully understand. The prisoners' behavior reflected not just fear of punishment, but something more complex, a growing appreciation for American prosperity and a dawning recognition that Nazi propaganda had been lies. The prisoners worked throughout the region, sent daily to canneries and fields within a 30 to 40-mile radius of Eaton. They processed tomatoes, picked vegetables, loaded trucks, operated machinery. They worked alongside American civilians under minimal supervision with increasing freedom of movement as the guards recognized they had little incentive to escape. Where would they go? Germany was an ocean away, being bombed to rubble. Here, they ate 3 meals daily, slept in dry tents, and earned money they could spend at the commissary. Escape meant giving up certainty for uncertainty, comfort for hardship, safety for risk. According to Harris's research, only one prisoner escaped from the Eaton camp. He returned on his own after a few days. When questioned about his whereabouts, he stated he had stayed with a woman in an adjoining town. The military authorities did not elaborate on this incident in official records. One can imagine their frustration. The escaped prisoner had not headed for the coast seeking a boat to Germany. He had not attempted sabotage or contacted enemy agents. He had found a woman who was willing to hide an enemy soldier, and he had stayed with her until he voluntarily returned to camp. This was the reality that challenged every assumption about how POWs and civilian populations were supposed to interact. The abstract categories of enemy and American were dissolving in the daily reality of human contact. The prisoners were becoming individuals with names, personalities, and stories. The Americans were discovering that enemy soldiers were not fanatics or monsters, but ordinary young men. The canning factories where prisoners worked provided daily opportunities for interaction that military regulations could not prevent. Prisoners and American workers labored side by side during the harvest season's intense push. They shared tools, coordinated tasks, and communicated through a growing mixture of English, German, and gesture. The American workers were predominantly women and older men, the young male workers being overseas. This created situations where young American women supervised German POW work details, instructing enemy soldiers in proper canning procedures, quality control, and equipment operation. The absurdity of the arrangement was apparently lost on no one, but necessity overrode propriety. One prisoner's surprise about intact Chicago revealed how thoroughly Nazi propaganda had deceived Wehrmacht soldiers. As they worked in functioning American factories, loading products bound for undestroyed cities, processed by an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany possessed, the cognitive dissonance became overwhelming. They had been told America was weak, decadent, incapable of industrial production. Yet, here they were, in a small Indiana town, watching vegetables processed in quantities that exceeded anything they had seen in Germany. The Eaton Canning Company was not even a major operation, just one small facility among thousands across the country. If this was what a minor American cannery could produce, what did that say about America's overall capacity? The prisoners began asking questions. American guards, workers, and townspeople, generally friendly and often talkative, provided answers that systematically demolished Nazi ideology. Yes, every American town had electricity. Yes, most families owned automobiles. Yes, the stores were full of goods. Yes, this was normal, not special preparation for the prisoners' benefit. The psychological transformation accelerated as prisoners gained access to American newspapers and magazines available at the camp library. They read about American military victories, industrial production statistics, and political debates. The newspapers themselves were revelatory. In Germany, the press was state-controlled, monolithic, predictable. Here, newspapers criticized the government, debated policy, and presented multiple viewpoints. This freedom of information, this absence of censorship, suggested a confidence that Nazi Germany had never possessed. Only a truly strong nation could tolerate criticism. Only a secure government could permit disagreement. The contrast was devastating to men raised on totalitarian control and propaganda. The camp's small library, mentioned briefly in official records, became a classroom in democracy. Prisoners checked out books in English, struggling through them with dictionaries, learning about American history, government, and culture. Some requested specific titles, others read whatever was available. The librarian, likely a volunteer from Eton, processed checkouts without apparent concern that she was educating enemy soldiers. The chapel services where they occurred created perhaps the strangest scenes. German POWs attending Protestant or Catholic services, singing hymns in German while American worshippers sang in English, all supposedly devoted to the same God while their nations tried to destroy each other. The theological implications were complex, but the practical effect was clear. Religious services reinforced the prisoners' humanity and created bonds between captors and captives that military regulations could not prevent. And then, there was the moonshine still reportedly hidden at the Austin camp. If the Eton camp had something similar, and many likely did, it represented an achievement in prisoner ingenuity and guard negligence. Distilling alcohol requires equipment, ingredients, knowledge, and time. The fact that prisoners could apparently construct and operate stills without being caught suggests either remarkable prisoner cleverness or remarkable guard indifference. Possibly both. The moonshine, if it existed, would have served multiple purposes, supplementing the bland camp diet, creating trading currency, and providing small rebellions against authority that made captivity more bearable. It also suggested that prisoners and guards had reached an accommodation where minor infractions were overlooked in exchange for general cooperation. This pragmatic flexibility characterized the entire POW camp system. Official regulations said one thing, daily practice required another. The military had learned that rigid enforcement was counterproductive. Prisoners who felt reasonably treated caused fewer problems than prisoners who felt oppressed. Small freedoms prevented large rebellions. As summer 1945 turned to autumn, the Eton camp processed the harvest that justified its existence. Tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, and other vegetables flowed through the Eton Canning Company in quantities that met military requirements and civilian needs. The prisoners worked steadily, earning their 80 cents daily, spending it at the commissary on cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and magazines. The town of Eton adjusted to having more prisoners than citizens within its boundaries when the Windfall camp flooded. The military had not informed residents of this development, but people noticed. Suddenly, there were more men in Wehrmacht pants and work shirts than there were townspeople on Main Street. The prisoners were everywhere, marching to work details, returning to camp, standing behind the barbed wire, watching town life pass by. And the women of Eton, despite Marshal Jefferson's concerns, apparently continued walking to the camp on Saturday nights, talking through the fence, flirting with men who had been designated enemies but were becoming something more complicated. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Nazi regime collapsed. Hitler was dead. The prisoners in American camps received this news with reactions ranging from relief to despair to confusion. The war was over, but they were still prisoners, still in America, still uncertain about their futures. The Eton camp continued operating through the autumn harvest. The prisoners were still needed. The work had to be completed. The war's end did not immediately change daily routines. They still marched to the canning company, still processed vegetables, still returned to their tents at night. But the psychological shift was profound. They were no longer prisoners of war in the technical sense, as the war had ended. They were prisoners waiting for repatriation to a Germany that existed only in ruins. Letters from home when they arrived brought devastating news: cities destroyed, families displaced, the economy collapsed, food scarce, the infrastructure wrecked. Some prisoners, reading these letters while eating 3 full meals daily in American camps, came to a realization that would have seemed treasonous months earlier. They were better off as prisoners in America than as free men in Germany. The Eton camp was decommissioned in November 1945. The canning season was over, and the military had no further use for a temporary facility in rural Indiana. The prisoners were processed, packed, and shipped out, most heading back to Germany through detention centers that would eventually repatriate them. The camp disappeared with remarkable speed. The tents came down, the barbed wire was rolled up, the guard towers were dismantled. The land returned to its previous use. Within weeks, little physical evidence remained that 600 enemy soldiers had lived there for months, but the legacy persisted in unexpected ways. Oscar Wagner had been a prisoner at the Eton camp. He was repatriated to Germany with the others, returning to a homeland that barely resembled the nation he had left. The cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. Food was desperately scarce. The future was uncertain and bleak. Wagner remembered America. He remembered Eton, Indiana. He remembered being treated with dignity, eating well, working for pay, and living without fear. In the ruined Germany of the late 1940s, these memories acquired new significance. America was not perfect, but it was functional, it was prosperous, it was safe. When the opportunity arose, Wagner applied for permission to return to the United States. The immigration process for former enemy combatants was complicated and lengthy, but Wagner persisted. He had made connections during his imprisonment, people who remembered him, who vouched for his character, who helped navigate bureaucracy. He returned to Delaware County, Indiana, the area where he had been a prisoner. This was not a common outcome, but it was not unique either. Online histories of POW camps note that numerous prisoners, after repatriation to Germany, chose to return to America. They immigrated legally, settled in the communities where they had been imprisoned, and built new lives. Wagner lived in Delaware County for decades. For many years, he was active in the city's annual Kiwanis Christmas tree sales lot, a beloved fixture in the community's holiday traditions. He became an American citizen. He married, worked, raised a family, and grew old in the place that had once held him prisoner. In 2008, when he was 92 years old, Wagner told an interviewer, "I've never felt so grateful as I do now." His life had taken him from conscription in the German army to combat, to capture and prisoner of war status, to repatriation to a destroyed homeland, to the decision to return to America, to settling in the area where he had been imprisoned, to becoming an American citizen, to old age in a country that had once been his enemy. He died in 2014 at age 97 and is buried in the city-owned Beech Grove Cemetery in Muncie, Indiana. His gravestone marks the resting place of a man who was born in Germany, fought for Germany, was captured by America's allies, imprisoned in America, repatriated to Germany, and then chose to return to America and live the rest of his life there. Wagner's story, remarkable as it is, was not isolated. The histories of POW camps across America contain similar narratives. Former prisoners who returned to marry American women they had corresponded with, men who came back to work on farms where they had labored as prisoners, soldiers who found in their imprisonment a vision of a better life than what awaited them in Germany. These outcomes were not what military planners had anticipated. The camps were supposed to hold prisoners securely until war's end, extract useful labor, and then send them home. They were not supposed to convert enemy soldiers into future American citizens. They were not supposed to create lasting bonds between captors and captives. They were not supposed to plant the seeds of immigration and permanent settlement. But that is what happened in Eaton and in hundreds of other small towns across America. The near-total absence of physical remnants of the camps contributes to their forgotten status. No historical markers indicate where the Eaton camp stood. The 17 acres have long since returned to other uses. The guard towers, barbed wire, and tents vanished 3/4 of a century ago. The buildings of the Eaton Canning Company, if any survive, bear no plaques commemorating the German prisoners who worked there. The photographs that survived military regulations against photography are few and precious. One shows German prisoners at the Eaton camp in 1945, identified in careful handwriting. Front row left to right, Erhard Albrecht, Reinhold Kurka, Ernst Kurbuhn, Hans Lübker, and Gebhard Biel. In the rear row, left to right, Bruno Walter, Kurt Romus, Ernst Huck, Siegfried Zenisch, and Karl Wiedmer. 10 men, frozen in a moment, standing together in their prisoner uniforms, looking at the camera with expressions that are difficult to read across the decades. They are young. Most appear to be in their 20s. They do not look particularly threatening or fanatical. They look like young men far from home, uncertain about their futures, making the best of difficult circumstances. What happened to these 10? Did they return to Germany? Did any come back to America like Oscar Wagner? Did they survive the difficult post-war years? Did they tell their children and grandchildren about their time in Indiana, about the cannery work, about the town of Eaton, about the American women who came to the fence on Saturday nights? The histories do not record their individual fates. They become part of the larger statistical mass of 400,000 German and Italian POWs held in America, most of whom returned to Europe and vanished into the post-war chaos of Reconstruction and Cold War division. But each of them had a story. Each experienced the same cognitive dissonance Wagner must have felt, the collision between Nazi propaganda and American reality. Each worked alongside American civilians, ate American food, witnessed American prosperity, and had to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. The forgotten history of the POW camps represents one of World War II's strangest chapters, a massive social experiment conducted without planning or theory, an integration of enemies that violated every assumption about how wars were supposed to be fought. 700 camps across the United States, more than 400,000 prisoners, hundreds of thousands of American civilians living near the camps, working alongside prisoners, interacting daily with men designated as enemies. The scale alone is remarkable. The outcomes were unprecedented. The camps challenged the clear categories that war requires: enemy and friend, us and them, good and evil. These binaries dissolved in daily contact. The German prisoners were not uniformed Nazi fanatics. Many were reluctant conscripts, forced into Wehrmacht service, fighting for a regime they had never fully supported. Some were not even German, but men from occupied territories wearing German uniforms. The American civilians were not uniform either. Some maintained deep hatred for Germans, refusing any contact beyond what was absolutely necessary. Others, particularly in German-American communities, felt complicated loyalties, speaking German with prisoners, discovering shared heritage, struggling with the contradiction of ethnic kinship and national enmity. And many Americans simply treated the prisoners as they would treat anyone, with basic courtesy, common decency, and occasional kindness. This casual humanity, more than any deliberate re-education program, transformed enemy soldiers into men who would choose to return to America after the war. The military authorities recognized what was happening, but could not fully control it. Their reports documented increasing fraternization, noted the difficulty of enforcement, and ultimately adopted a pragmatic approach. As long as security was maintained and work requirements were met, minor violations were overlooked. This pragmatism allowed the strange coexistence to continue. German prisoners became part of their communities in ways that defied regulations but served everyone's needs. The prisoners gained relatively comfortable imprisonment. The communities gained needed labor. The guards gained cooperative prisoners who caused few problems. And occasionally, remarkably, lasting connections formed, romance through barbed wire, friendships between former enemies, respect between captors and captives. These outcomes were not policy goals. They emerged organically from daily human contact that military regulations could prohibit but not prevent. Marshal Earl Jefferson's concern about keeping the women of Eton away from the prisoners reflected his recognition that human nature was stronger than military regulation. Young women and young men, whatever their national allegiances, would find ways to connect. Saturday night walks to the camp fence were predictable once 600 young male prisoners were living on the edge of a small town where most young men were overseas. The military could have prevented this with sufficient guards, but sufficient guards did not exist. America was fighting a global war. Every available soldier was needed for combat or essential support roles. Guarding prisoners in rural Indiana was necessary but not prioritized. The 44 American enlisted men guarding hundreds of prisoners at Eton could not possibly monitor every interaction. So the interactions continued, creating the strange intimacy of enemies living as neighbors. The prisoners watched American life from behind barbed wire. Americans watched the prisoners. Both sides learned that the other was more complex, more human, less monstrous than propaganda had suggested. This mutual recognition was perhaps the camp's most important legacy. The prisoners who returned to Germany carried knowledge of America that contradicted Nazi ideology. They had lived in America, worked alongside Americans, and experienced American society firsthand. When they participated in Germany's reconstruction, this knowledge influenced their choices. The Americans who lived near the camps also learned lessons. They discovered that enemy soldiers were not uniformly evil, that nationality did not determine character, that even in war, human connections could form across enemy lines. These lessons would prove valuable in the post-war world when former enemies had to become allies. The story of the POW camps is ultimately a story about the inadequacy of propaganda in the face of direct experience. The prisoners had been told America was weak, decadent, Jewish-controlled, on the verge of collapse. They discovered a nation of stunning industrial capacity, relative prosperity, diverse population, and functioning democracy. The Americans had been told Germans were fanatical Nazis, goose-stepping automatons, believers in racial superiority and totalitarian control. They discovered ordinary young men, many of whom had never supported Hitler, forced into uniforms in combat, now just trying to survive imprisonment and get home. Both sides learned that reality was more complicated than propaganda. This lesson, replicated across 700 camps and hundreds of thousands of interactions, helped create the foundation for the post-war Atlantic Alliance. Former enemies became allies because they had learned, during the strange coexistence of the POW camps, that they were not so different after all. Oscar Wagner's gravestone in Beech Grove Cemetery is a monument to this transformation. Born in Germany, buried in America, his life bridged the chasm between nations at war and became a testimony to the possibility of redemption, reconciliation, and new beginnings. The camps are forgotten now, their barracks and tents long vanished, their stories surviving only in fragments. But their legacy persists in the German-American friendships that formed during those strange years, in the former prisoners who chose to return and become Americans, in the communities that learned to see past enemy designations to the humans beneath. Marshal Earl Jefferson's worry about keeping women away from the prisoners seems quaint now, almost comical. but it captured something essential about the impossibility of maintaining rigid separation between people living in close proximity. Humans will be human, even in wartime, even across enemy lines, even when regulations say they should not. The women of Eton walked to the camp on Saturday nights and talked through the fence. This small act of defiance, this human connection across barbed wire, symbolizes the entire strange story of German POWs living among Americans. It was not supposed to happen. Military regulations forbade it, yet it happened anyway, because human nature was stronger than military policy, because loneliness transcends nationality, because even in war the desire for connection persists. And sometimes, remarkably, those connections transformed enemies into friends, prisoners into neighbors, and eventually, in cases like Oscar Wagner's, former captives into citizens. This was not the war anyone planned to fight, but it was, in its strange way, a war that produced unexpected victories, the quiet triumph of human connection over ideological hatred. The forgotten camps of World War II deserve to be remembered, not for their strategic importance or military significance, but for what they revealed about human nature and the possibility of transformation. 700 camps, 400,000 prisoners, countless interactions, and outcomes that nobody anticipated. Enemy soldiers became neighbors, neighbors became friends, and sometimes, remarkably, friends became family. In the ruins of war, strange seeds of peace were planted. The harvest would come decades later, but it began in places like Eton, Indiana, where German prisoners and American civilians learned to see past propaganda to the humans on the other side of the barbed wire. That was the greatest victory the camps achieved, not through violence or coercion, but through the simple, persistent, irrepressible human desire to connect across even the deepest divides. The women of Eton understood this instinctively when they walked to the fence on Saturday nights. They were not committing treason, they were being human. And in that humanity lay the seeds of transformation that would eventually turn enemies into allies and help build the post-war world where German and American soldiers would stand together as partners rather than adversaries. The strange story of the POW camps is ultimately a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, human connection can bridge the widest chasms and plant seeds of peace in the most unlikely soil.